When my son died, I told myself the hardest part was over. Then his business partner called me 2 days after the burial, and everything I thought I knew collapsed. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Harold, I need you to come by the shop. Don't mention it to your daughter-in-law. There's something you have to see in person, and I don't know who else to trust." I asked him what kind of something. He paused for a long moment. "The kind that doesn't let me sleep." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, the coffee going cold on the counter behind me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air pressing through the window seams. 41 years as a county sheriff will teach you to recognize that particular silence, the kind that comes before the worst news you've ever heard. My son Danny was 38 years old when he died on Ravens Bluff Trail outside Asheville, North Carolina. He fell, the park rangers said. A section of the trail near the overlook, loose shale, poor footing. His wife and 2 of their friends had been with him that morning. They said he'd stepped too close to the edge to take a photograph, and then he was gone. By the time the rescue team reached him, there was nothing left to rescue. I had driven up from Knoxville the moment I got the call. I remembered standing at the base of that mountain, looking up at the tree line, not quite believing the shape of the air around me had permanently changed. My daughter-in-law had been sitting on a park bench wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, weeping into her hands. I had gone to her and held her because she was my son's wife and she was in pain, and because it never once occurred to me to think anything other than that this was a terrible accident. That was before the phone call. The night of the funeral, I had noticed small things I filed away without meaning to. Old habit. My daughter-in-law received a text at the graveside and turned slightly away from the group to read it, her shoulders relaxing in a way that didn't match the occasion. A man I didn't recognize stood at the far edge of the gathering, not someone from Danny's firm or from the neighborhood, wearing a jacket that was too clean and new for someone who'd come to mourn. He caught her eye once. She looked away too quickly. When I mentioned him to her afterward, she said he was a colleague from her gym who'd seen the obituary. She moved on from the subject before I could ask his name. "I'm 64 years old. I have seen grief in every form it takes, and I have seen its imitations. Something in the texture of that afternoon had been wrong. The way a scene can look right from a distance, but fall apart the moment you step close enough to examine the details." 2 mornings after the burial, I drove to Danny's shop. He had built a small custom furniture business over 12 years. Quality hardwood work, the kind of careful craftsmanship that takes patience. His partner, a man named Ed Fowler, had been with him since the beginning. Ed was waiting for me in the back office with the door closed, a printed spreadsheet on the desk between us, and an expression like a man who had been awake for 72 hours. He didn't waste time. He turned the spreadsheet toward me and pointed to a column of withdrawals from the business account. 6 months of them, totaling just over $60,000. All authorized with Danny's digital signature. All transferred to an account Ed had never seen before. "I found them 3 weeks ago," Ed said. I didn't say anything, because Danny asked me not to look into it. He said his wife was handling a personal debt situation, and it was temporary. I trusted him. He pressed his fingers flat on the desk. Then he died, and last week she called to tell me she's planning to sell the business. I asked if Danny had known about all of it. "That's the part I can't figure out," Ed said. "Some of the transfers happened on days I know for a fact Danny was here in this shop, working. He never left. I was with him, but his signature is on every one." I looked at the dates. I looked at the amounts. In 38 years of law enforcement, I had investigated embezzlement twice, and I recognized the pattern immediately. Amounts kept just below the threshold that triggers automatic bank review. Irregular enough to avoid a pattern flag, regular enough to accumulate fast. "There's something else," Ed said. He opened a folder. Inside was a printout of a life insurance policy. Danny's name on it. My daughter-in-law listed as sole beneficiary. $600,000. Issued 14 months ago. I remembered Danny calling me around that time. He'd seemed distracted, a little tired. When I'd asked how things were, he'd said my daughter-in-law was pushing him to think about long-term financial security. I told him that sounded sensible. I hadn't asked any more questions. I wished then, sitting in that office, that I had asked every question I could think of. Ed handed me a USB drive. He'd copied everything: the spreadsheets, the bank notices, a series of emails between my daughter-in-law and someone identified only by a Gmail address, recovered from the business cloud account she'd accessed using Danny's login. Ed had discovered her session in the account history 2 days after Danny's death, time-stamped at 11 at night. I drove home with the drive in my shirt pocket and the spreadsheets folded under my arm. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the truck in the driveway for a long time, watching the neighbor's oak tree move against the gray sky, doing what I had trained myself to do over 4 decades of investigations. I made myself slow down. I made myself separate what I knew from what I suspected. Facts first, conclusions later. What I knew: $60,000 missing. A signature my son may not have written. A large insurance policy, taken out 14 months before his death. A woman at the funeral he didn't introduce. A hike from which only Danny didn't come home. What I suspected, I wasn't ready to write down yet. My daughter-in-law was staying in the house she and Danny had shared, 20 minutes from my place. She called me that evening to check in, warm and soft-voiced, asking if I was eating, saying she was worried about me being alone. She mentioned, briefly and gently, that she'd been speaking with a realtor about the house, just exploring options, she said. Grieving in that big space was so hard. I told her I understood. I said I'd come by for dinner that weekend. She said she'd make something comforting, and she'd be glad to have the company. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the USB drive on my laptop. The emails were fragmented, only the pieces that had passed through the business account. But they were enough. A man named Garrett, no last name given, writing to my daughter-in-law in shorthand that read like 2 people who had been speaking privately for a long time. References to the timeline. References to after everything settles. One message from 9 months before Danny's death. The hiking trip works. End-of-season crowds are thin, and that section of the trail doesn't have cameras past the first marker. Her response: he always goes to the overlook. Every single time. He's predictable that way. I read those 2 sentences 4 times. My hands on the table were completely steady. Not because I wasn't feeling anything, because I had learned, a very long time ago, that the moment you let feeling drive the wheel, the case falls apart, and the guilty walk free. I was not Harold the father right now. I was Harold the former sheriff of Blount County, and I had a job to do. The next morning, I called my old deputy, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who had retired 2 years before me and now ran a private investigation practice out of Maryville. I told her I needed to meet. She cleared her afternoon. Patricia listened without interrupting while I laid out everything on her conference table. The spreadsheets, the insurance policy, Ed's account of the unauthorized withdrawals, the email fragments. She read the 2 key sentences twice, folded her hands, and looked at me. You know what this means, she said. I need it documented before I take it anywhere official. The park footage, she said immediately. Ravens Bluff has cameras at the trailhead and the first half-mile marker. Who this Garrett is, and whether he appears on that footage the morning Danny died. That's your first thread. She pulled a notepad toward her. I'll also run his email address against known aliases, social media, property records. Give me 72 hours. I drove home and did the hardest thing I had done since standing at the base of that mountain. I called my daughter-in-law and told her I was having a bad few days, that I needed some space to process, and that I'd reschedule dinner. She said, of course, absolutely. Take all the time I needed. She was here whenever I was ready. Her voice was everything, gentleness. I thanked her and ended the call and stood at the window watching the street and thinking about the son she had taken from me. I thought about Danny at 7 years old, teaching himself to ride a bicycle in this same driveway over 2 stubborn summer days because he refused to let me hold the seat. I thought about him at 22, calling me from his first apartment, laughing because he'd set off the smoke alarm trying to make pasta. I thought about the last time I'd seen him alive, a Sunday in October, sitting across from me at this kitchen table eating chili, talking about a dining table commission he was excited about, the grain of the wood, how he was going to dovetail the corners. He had his mother's hands. She died when he was 16, and sometimes when I watched him work, I could see her in the shape of his concentration. I let myself sit with that for exactly 10 minutes. Then I went to my desk and opened my investigator's notebook and got back to work. Patricia called me on the third day. The trailhead footage from the morning Danny died showed my daughter-in-law arriving with 2 people. Not 2, 3. The third was a man who signed the trail register as a guest of the party. Patricia had frozen his image from the footage and run it against social media. His name was Garrett Voss, 34 years old, a personal trainer at a fitness club in West Asheville, employed at the same gym my daughter-in-law had belonged to for 2 years. She sent me his photograph. It was the man from the funeral, the one in the too clean jacket. Patricia also found something in the property records. Garrett Voss had co-signed a lease application 4 months before Danny's death on an apartment in Charleston, South Carolina. The other signature on the application was my daughter-in-law's name. I printed the lease application and added it to my folder. The folder was getting thick. Over the next 2 weeks, I played a role I despised. I accepted my daughter-in-law's dinner invitation. I sat across the table from her and ate the chicken she'd made and asked appropriate questions about how she was sleeping, whether she was seeing a grief counselor, how she was managing the business transition. She was beautiful in her concern for me. She touched my hand when she asked if I was doing okay. She mentioned the house again, gently, that she was thinking of relocating somewhere smaller and warmer. A fresh start, she said. She thought she'd look at the Charleston area. She'd heard it was lovely. I said that sounded like a good idea. I let my shoulders drop and my voice go a little vague, the way a grieving old man's might. I told her I was just so tired. She patted my hand again and said she understood, and I watched her eyes while she said it. Behind my shirt pocket, the small recorder Patricia had given me was running. I had dinner with her 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Each time I let the conversation drift toward Danny's estate, his business, the insurance policy. Each time she found natural ways to arrive at the same destination. She would help me with the paperwork. She knew a lawyer who specialized in estate transitions. It would be simpler for me if she coordinated directly with the insurance company on my behalf. I wouldn't have to deal with any of it. She was here for me. What she didn't know was that Patricia had been outside each time, and that the recordings were being reviewed by the district attorney's office in Buncombe County, where the death had occurred. I had gone to the investigators there on day 11. A detective named Sorrells, who had originally ruled the death accidental. He had been skeptical in our first meeting. By the second, when I brought Patricia, the trailhead footage, the lease application, and the email fragments, his expression had changed entirely. The trail register shows 3 names, he said, spreading the documents. Voss signed in with the party. He was there. I told him that Voss had not appeared in any of the news coverage or the park ranger interviews, that my daughter-in-law had never mentioned a third person on the trail to me in any of our conversations. Sorrells pulled up the original incident report. The ranger's account referenced 2 witnesses, my daughter-in-law and a friend she had brought along. The second person was listed as female. Garrett Voss was not accounted for at all. Sorrells looked at me. Where was he when the rangers arrived? I told him I didn't know. I told him that was exactly what concerned me. Sorrells reopened the case as an active investigation that afternoon. Patricia began surveillance on Garrett Voss the following week. He was still in Asheville, still training clients, still checking his phone with the nervous regularity of a man who expected bad news. On the 4th day of surveillance, my daughter-in-law drove to Asheville and met him at a restaurant near the river. Patricia positioned herself with a long-range audio device at the outdoor seating adjacent to theirs. The recording was 73 minutes long. I listened to all of it. The first 40 minutes were ordinary, at least on the surface. Discussion of logistics, the Charleston apartment, a timeline for when she could realistically transfer funds after the insurance settled, how long she'd need to maintain the appearance of grieving before she could leave Tennessee without it looking calculated. Then Voss asked about the business sale. She told him Ed Fowler was being difficult, that he'd been asking questions she didn't like. Voss said, "What kind of questions?" She said, "About the transfers. He found something in the accounts." I told him it was personal, But he's suspicious. He's the type who doesn't let things go, Voss said. Is he going to be a problem? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he was already there that morning. He'd hiked that trail a dozen times. It would look very different than it did with Danny. I stopped the recording. I sat at my kitchen table in the silence of my house, and I allowed myself exactly one moment of something I cannot name, something between grief and rage, and the cold certainty of a man who has just heard a person discuss the murder of his son as a logistical problem, and the potential murder of his son's friend as a solution to a complication. Then I called Sorrells. He had a warrant within 36 hours. Phone records pulled, financial accounts subpoenaed, the insurance company notified, and the $600,000 claim suspended pending investigation. The arrest came on a Thursday morning, early. Sorrells called to tell me what had happened. His team had taken Garrett Voss first, at 6 a.m, at his apartment. Voss had been told his phone records contradicted his statements about his location. The morning Danny died, he had an attorney within the hour. What the attorney did not know, and what Sorrells had withheld strategically, was the full scope of the recording. The phone records alone were enough to hold him. The recording would come later. My daughter-in-law was arrested at her house at 7:15. A neighbor called me about it, having seen the police vehicles. I already knew. I was sitting in this same kitchen, the notebook open in front of me, and when my phone showed her name on the screen, I let it ring out. She left a voicemail. She was crying in the recording, voice trembling, saying there had been a terrible mistake, that she needed me, that I was the only family she had left, that she loved Danny, and she loved me, and this was all a misunderstanding. I listened to it once and deleted it. Her attorney filed a bail application citing ties to the community. No prior record. A woman in grief who was being targeted by a vindictive relative. The bail was set at $300,000. Her parents secured it. She was released with an ankle monitor and travel restrictions confining her to a 50-mile radius of Knoxville. She called from her mother's house that night using a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I didn't recognize it. She was quieter this time. No tears. She said, "You did this." I said that she had done this, and that Danny had deserved better than what she gave him, and that I intended to make sure she understood that, in the clearest possible terms. I ended the call. Ed Fowler retained his own attorney and filed a civil claim against the estate for the $60,000 in fraudulent transfers. Patricia referred me to a litigation attorney named Donovan in Knoxville, a former prosecutor who had spent 20 years building wrongful death cases. I met with him the following week and spread everything across his conference table. Donovan read quietly for 40 minutes. He made 3 pages of notes. When he looked up, he said, "She made one critical error." I asked which one. She brought Voss to that trailhead and signed him into the register under her party. She created a paper record of his presence. Her story to the Rangers omitted him. That's not a gap in memory. That's a deliberate lie to a law enforcement officer at the scene of a death, and it points directly to consciousness of guilt. He tapped the trail register printout. Add the lease application, the financial fraud, and that restaurant recording, and you have one of the cleaner conspiracy cases I've seen in 20 years. We filed a wrongful death lawsuit in circuit court in early January. $2.2 million in damages, loss of Danny's companionship, his future earnings, punitive damages reflecting the premeditated nature of the act. My daughter-in-law was served at her parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon. She called Garrett Voss 17 times in the 48 hours after she was served. Patricia, still conducting surveillance at my request, documented each attempt. Voss answered twice. The second conversation was recorded through the audio device still positioned near his apartment. He told her his attorney had advised him to take a deal. He told her he was sorry, but he wasn't going to prison for life when there was a 15-year offer on the table if he cooperated fully. She told him if he testified against her, she would tell them everything he'd done, every detail. She would make sure he went down with her. He said, "You were the one who planned it. You came to me. I'll tell them exactly what you said and when you said it." She hung up. The following week, Garrett Voss accepted a plea agreement. Second-degree murder conspiracy. 15 years. full cooperation with the prosecution, including testimony in the civil trial. His deposition was taken on a Wednesday in February, in a conference room with both attorneys present. I was not in the room, but Donovan sent me the transcript that evening. Voss described how she had approached him at the gym 13 months before Danny's death, how she had framed it initially as being trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape financially, how the conversation, over a series of weeks, had moved from abstract frustration to specific planning. She had researched Raven's Bluff Trail herself. She had identified the overlook section, the camera gap past the first marker, the seasonal drop in foot traffic. She had suggested October. She had told Voss that Danny always went to the overlook, that he would walk right to the edge without hesitation because he liked to photograph the valley. He'd been standing behind Danny when she moved to take the photo from the other side. It took less than 3 seconds. Danny had not made a sound that Voss heard. Voss said he had told himself he could live with what he had done. He said he had discovered he was wrong about that. I folded the transcript and put it in the folder and didn't open it again that night. The civil trial began in March. Donovan presented the evidence in a sequence so methodical it left no room for interpretation. The financial fraud first, Martha's forensic accounting laying out the $60,000 scheme in terms any juror could follow. Then the insurance policy, the timing of it, the agent's testimony that Danny had seemed reluctant but had eventually complied at my daughter-in-law's insistence. Then the trail register, the footage, the lie to the Rangers. Then the restaurant recording, her voice filling the courtroom, discussing Danny's death in the same practical register you'd use to discuss rescheduling an appointment. Voss testified on the 5th day of trial. He looked thinner than his surveillance photographs. He sat in the witness box with his hands flat on his knees, and he told the jury what had happened at Raven's Bluff in plain, unvarnished sentences. He did not minimize his own role. He did not attempt to appear sympathetic. He simply described, in sequence, what had been planned and what he had done. My daughter-in-law sat at the defense table in a gray dress that had been carefully chosen to project remorse. Her attorney had built a defense around the argument that Voss was an unreliable witness trading testimony for a reduced sentence, that the financial transfers were authorized and legitimate, that the emails were ambiguous, that the recording from the restaurant was taken out of context. Each argument, when placed next to the weight of everything else, became smaller and then disappeared. On the 6th day, Donovan called a forensic pathologist who had re-examined the autopsy in light of the new evidence. The angle of impact, she testified, was inconsistent with a forward fall from a standing position. It was consistent with a lateral impact, with a body that had been pushed from the side with sufficient force. This had not been examined at the original autopsy because the death had been ruled accidental before any forensic questions were asked. Several jurors stopped taking notes and simply watched. My daughter-in-law maintained her expression throughout the trial with considerable discipline. She had been coached well, but when the pathologist's testimony concluded, I saw her jaw tighten for just a moment, just a fraction, the first crack in the performance. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Liable, both defendants. Wrongful death of Danny Harold Marsh. Damages awarded in the amount of $1.9 million. I was sitting in the second row of gallery when the foreman read the numbers. I didn't react visibly. I had promised myself I wouldn't. This was not a moment for satisfaction. It was a moment for acknowledgement, for the record to say, formally and permanently, that my son had been murdered and that the people who murdered him were accountable. Outside the courthouse, Donovan shook my hand and said, "The criminal trial is next. Given the civil verdict and Voss's cooperation, her attorney is almost certainly going to advise a plea." He was right. She accepted a plea 3 weeks later. Conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. 28 years without parole. I attended the sentencing. She spoke before the judge imposed the sentence. She said she was sorry. She said she had made choices she could not take back. She said she knew no words were adequate. The judge listened to all of it, and then told her that Danny Marsh had been a young man with decades of life and work and love ahead of him, that she had calculated his worth against her own ambitions, and decided he was expendable, and that this court found no justification and no mercy appropriate. 28 years. The insurance company formally voided her claim 2 days after sentencing, citing the legal bar on beneficiaries who caused the death of the insured. The $600,000 she had killed my son for would never reach her hands. The civil judgment was attached to any assets she held. She would leave prison, if she lived that long, with nothing. Ed Fowler recovered the $60,000 through his civil claim. He came to my house the afternoon after sentencing and sat on the back porch with me in the cold spring air. And we talked about Danny the way you talk about someone you loved when the weight of the past year finally begins to lift. Ed told me about a dovetail joint Danny had shown him 2 years ago, a particular technique for fitting corners without mechanical fasteners, how Ed had tried it 6 times and never quite matched the precision of Danny's hands. He laughed when he said it, and then went quiet. I told him that sounded exactly right. Before Ed left, he told me he'd decided to keep the business running under Danny's name. He'd taken on a young apprentice in January, a kid from the vocational program at the high school, and the kid had the same careful patience that Danny had shown at that age. Ed said he thought Danny would approve. I drove to the cemetery the following Saturday. It was early April, and the ground was soft, and the oak trees along the western edge were just beginning to green at the tips. I stood at Danny's headstone for a long time without speaking, the way you do when you've been carrying on a conversation in your mind for months and finally arrive at the place where the other person should be. I told him it was done. I told him what had happened, the verdict, the sentence, the insurance claim voided, Ed keeping the shop. I told him about the apprentice who had his patience. I told him I was sorry I hadn't asked more questions when he called me that October Sunday, sounding distracted, that I had trusted things to be as they appeared, and I should have known better. That the one time in my life I had needed my training and I had been too close to the subject to use it. That I would have to live with that. The trees moved in the quiet. I placed my hand on the cool face of the granite. I kept my promise, I said. Every last piece of it. On the drive home, I passed the shop. The sign above the door still read Danny Marsh Custom Woodwork in the block. Lettering Danny had painted himself the year he opened, the paint worn at the edges but holding. Through the window, I could see the light on in the back. Someone working late. I sat at the curb for a moment and looked at it. Then I drove home, walked into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and sat at the table with my notebook open in front of me. The notebook I had started the night after Ed's call. The one that had gone from suspicions to evidence to case file to a record of every step of the past 5 months. I closed it, put my pen down beside it. Outside, the April dark was settling over the neighborhood, quiet and ordinary in the way that life becomes again after the extraordinary has finished its work on you. I thought about Danny at 7 years old on the driveway with the bicycle, getting up every time he fell, never asking me to hold the seat, just absolutely certain that if he kept at it long enough, he would eventually get it right. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I drank my coffee and let the house be quiet around me. Justice had been done. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in any way that returned what had been taken. But it had been done. The record existed now. The accountability was permanent. And somehow, in the tired bones of a 64-year-old man who had done what he set out to do, that had to be enough.